They say the sky is the limit, but for Leo Martinez the sky wasn't a limit. It was a promise. Living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment with his grandmother Elena, the sky was his escape. From the chipped paint on their walls, from the constant worry in Eleanor's eyes about the next bill, from the world that seemed to only see a poor boy from the wrong side of the tracks. Leo was 16, but he carried the weight of a man twice his age. His parents were gone, a story whispered in hushed, sad tones, and Elena's meager pension was all they had. His hands were calloused from after-school jobs, washing dishes and stocking shelves, but his mind was always somewhere else, at 30,000 feet. His one luxury, his only treasure, was a computer he'd built from discarded parts. On its flickering screen, he wasn't Leo the janitor's assistant. He was Captain Martinez. He had spent thousands of hours on a flight simulator. He knew the cockpit of a Boeing 777 better than he knew the streets of his own neighborhood. He'd memorized emergency procedures, studied flight patterns, and learned the intricate dance of communication with air traffic control. It was his secret world, a world where he was in control, where his circumstances didn't define him. His grandmother would watch him, a sad smile on her face. She saw the fire in his eyes and prayed the world wouldn't extinguish it. "One day, mijo," she'd say, "you will touch those clouds for real." On the other side of the city, in a glass tower that scraped the very sky Leo dreamed of, lived a man who owned it. His name was Arthur Sterling. Sterling wasn't just a millionaire. He was a titan, a predator in a world of prey. He saw people not as souls but as assets or liabilities. His heart was a fortress, fortified by wealth and arrogance. He flew in private jets, dined in exclusive restaurants, and believed that money was not just a tool, but a measure of a man's worth. By his metric, a boy like Leo Martinez was worth less than the dirt on his $1,000 shoes. Mr. Sterling saw kindness as a weakness and humility as a character flaw. His world was one of ruthless efficiency, of closing deals and crushing competitors. He moved through life with an air of entitlement that was as palpable as the expensive cologne he wore. He never saw the faces of the people who served him, the waiters, the drivers, the cleaners. They were invisible, mere functions in the grand machinery of his comfort. He believed he had earned his place at the top, and from that vantage point, he looked down on everyone else. He was a king in a kingdom of his own making, utterly unaware of the invisible threads that connect us all, the shared humanity that binds the pauper to the prince. He was flying to Chicago for a hostile takeover, another battle to be won, another company to be gutted for profit. He was at the peak of his power, untouchable and unmovable. Two men, a boy and a titan, living in the same city but on different planets. One who dreamed of the sky, the other who believed he owned it. They had never met, they had no reason to. But fate, in its mysterious and often cruel way, was about to place them in the same metal tube miles above the earth to teach them a lesson about the true measure of a man. For Leo, it started not with a bang, but with a simple envelope. An envelope from a local charity that his grandmother volunteered for, containing a single impossible prize from a raffle he didn't even remember entering. It was a round-trip ticket to Chicago to visit a distant cousin he hadn't seen in years. It was for Flight 815, departing the next morning. His first time ever on a real airplane. He was holding a golden ticket, a chance to finally feel the rumble of the engines he'd only ever heard through speakers. But he had no idea it was a ticket to the most terrifying and pivotal day of his life. The airport was a universe unto itself, a symphony of controlled chaos, of tearful goodbyes and joyful hellos. For Leo, it was overwhelming. The sheer scale of it, the towering ceilings, the roar of jets taking off. It was his digital dream made real. He clutched his single backpack, feeling small and out of place among the confident business travelers and seasoned vacationers. His ticket was for economy, of course, but he'd arrived early just to soak it all in. He found a spot near the windows, pressing his face against the glass, watching the ground crews move with practiced efficiency. He identified each plane model, his mind reciting their specs, their cruising speeds, their maximum range. This was his church, and these were the angels. As he watched, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb of the private terminal nearby. Arthur Sterling emerged, barking orders into his phone. He didn't walk, he marched, a trail of assistants scrambling behind him. But his private jet, he was told, had a last-minute mechanical issue. It was grounded. For a normal person, this was an inconvenience. For Arthur Sterling, it was an insult. He slammed his phone shut. "Get me on the next commercial flight to Chicago," he snapped at his assistant. "First class. I don't care what it costs." That flight, of course, was Flight 815. While his assistant handled the details, Sterling stood impatiently, his scowl deepening. It was then that he saw Leo. Not Leo the dreamer, but Leo the obstacle. Leo was so captivated by a 777 being pushed back from the gate that he had inadvertently stood in Mr. Sterling's path to the first-class lounge. Sterling didn't say, "Excuse me." He simply said, "Move." The word was sharp, cold, dismissive. Leo, startled, turned around. He saw the expensive suit, the angry face, the aura of immense power. He mumbled an apology, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," and quickly stepped aside, his cheeks burning with shame. Sterling didn't even acknowledge him. He just swept past, leaving Leo feeling even smaller than before. It was a tiny interaction, meaningless to one man, a small wound for the other. It was the universe solidifying their roles, the titan and the nobody, the man who owned the world and the boy who was just in the way. Boarding the plane, Leo felt a thrill that erased the sting of the encounter. He found his seat, a middle seat in row 32. It was cramped, but it was perfect. He was in. He was really doing it. As the other passengers filed in, he saw him again. Mr. Sterling was escorted to seat 1A, the throne of first class. He handed his coat to the flight attendant without a word of thanks and immediately opened his laptop, the glow of spreadsheets illuminating his stony face. He was already in Chicago in his mind, already carving up his next acquisition. He was sealed in his bubble of privilege, separated from the regular people by a thin curtain. The doors closed. The safety demonstration began, ignored by nearly everyone, including Sterling. But Leo watched intently, his eyes following the flight attendant's every move, his mind cross-referencing her words with the manuals he had studied. The engines began to whine, a sound that was pure music to Leo's ears. The plane taxied, turned onto the runway, and paused. For a moment, everything was still. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the moment of truth. The engines roared to life, pressing him back into his seat. The world outside became a blur, and then with a gentle lift, they were airborne. Gravity had lost its hold. He looked out the tiny window, watching the ground shrink away, the cars becoming toys, the world he knew dissolving into a map. He was free. He was flying. But as the plane climbed through the clouds, ascending to its cruising altitude, a chain of events had already been set in motion, a silent, invisible threat that was climbing with them. It was a threat that no amount of money could stop, and only one boy's impossible dream could fight. 30,000 feet is a peaceful place, above the weather, above the noise, above the problems of the world below. For an hour, Flight 815 was a perfect microcosm of society. In the back, families shared snacks, students listened to music, and Leo Martinez stared out at the endless blue horizon, his heart full. He felt a sense of belonging he'd never felt on the ground. Up here, everyone was a passenger, a traveler suspended between one place and the next. He bought a small model of the 777 from the in-flight magazine, a treasure he would keep forever. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced smiles, serving drinks and snacks, their calm demeanor a reassuring blanket over the 143 souls on board. The gentle hum of the engines was a lullaby, and many passengers drifted off to sleep. It was a routine flight, one of thousands crisscrossing the country at that very moment, a mundane miracle of modern engineering. In seat 1A, Arthur Sterling was not at peace. He was at war. He had complained about the Wi-Fi speed. He had sent back his sparkling water because the brand wasn't to his liking. He spoke to the flight attendants not as people, but as extensions of the service he had paid for. He was utterly oblivious to the quiet dignity with which they served him, the forced smiles they maintained in the face of his rudeness. He was in his own world, a world of numbers and power plays, completely disconnected from the humanity around him. He reviewed his presentation, his face grim. The only thing that mattered was his destination and the victory that awaited him there. The pilots, Captain Evans and First Officer Davis, were veterans. They'd shared countless hours in the cockpit, their conversation a familiar rhythm of checklists, weather reports, and easy chatter. They'd eaten the same crew meal, a chicken dish prepared specifically for the cockpit crew, a standard procedure. Leo, meanwhile, was lost in his own world. He closed his eyes and tried to feel the plane. He imagined the inputs the pilots were making, the subtle adjustments of the ailerons, the constant monitoring of the systems. He could almost see the instrument panel in his mind's eye, the glowing green lights of the autopilot, the altitude and airspeed indicators. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a student in the greatest classroom he could ever imagine. He felt a deep, profound respect for the unseen pilots in the front, the men entrusted with all these lives. He hoped one day to be worthy of such a trust. The cabin was quiet. A baby cried for a moment and was quickly soothed. A man in the row ahead of Leo was snoring softly. It was a scene of perfect, unremarkable normalcy. The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows down the aisle. But then a subtle change, a single, almost imperceptible shudder. It wasn't turbulence. It was something else. The flight attendants paused, exchanging a quick, questioning glance. The engine noise seemed to change pitch ever so slightly. Up in the cockpit, Captain Evans frowned. "Did you feel that?" he asked his co-pilot. First Officer Davis nodded, his face suddenly pale. "Something's not right," he mumbled, his hand reaching for the controls. A bead of sweat trickled down the captain's temple. He keyed his microphone to speak to the cabin, to offer a reassuring word about light turbulence, but the words never came out. Instead, he slumped forward, his body going limp against the yoke. A moment later, his co-pilot did the same. Both men were unconscious, struck down by a sudden, catastrophic medical emergency. The autopilot, for a few precious seconds, kept the plane level. But the pilot's dead weight was pushing on the controls, and the nose of the massive jet began to dip. The chime for the seatbelt sign flicked on, followed by a recorded message. But there was no calm, reassuring voice from the captain this time. There was only silence. And then the plane began to fall. The drop was sudden and sickening. It wasn't the gentle dip of turbulence. It was a lurch, a stomach-churning plunge that sent loose items flying and yanked sleeping passengers into a state of sheer terror. The quiet hum of the cabin was shattered by a chorus of screams. Drinks carts, not yet secured, toppled over, sending cans and plastic cups rattling down the aisle. People gripped their armrests, their knuckles turning white, their faces a mask of confusion and fear. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't right. His simulator had taught him what a stall felt like, what a rapid descent entailed. This was uncontrolled. The plane shuddered violently, the wings groaning under the strain. The flight attendants, professionals to the core, fought to stay on their feet, their faces pale but their voices firm, shouting for everyone to stay calm and fasten their seatbelts. In first class, Arthur Sterling was thrown against his seatbelt, his laptop sliding off his tray and crashing to the floor. For the first time in his life, his money meant nothing. His power was an illusion. He was just another passenger, trapped in a metal tube plummeting from the sky. His first reaction wasn't fear, but rage. He unbuckled his seatbelt, a foolish and dangerous move, and stumbled towards the cockpit door. "What's going on?" he yelled at a flight attendant, a young woman named Clara. "Tell your pilot to fly the damn plane." Clara, her own fear held in check by years of training, blocked his path. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," she commanded, her voice shaking but resolute. The plane dipped again, more sharply this time, and Sterling was thrown against the bulkhead. The illusion of his control was utterly, completely shattered. He was helpless. The cabin was a cacophony of prayer and panic. People were crying, holding their loved ones, their faces etched with the horrifying realization that these might be their final moments. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, a terrifying sight that signaled the true gravity of the situation. Clara, the lead flight attendant, knew she had to do something. Following emergency protocol, she used the intercom to try and contact the cockpit. "Captain Evans? First Officer Davis? Please respond." Only static answered. Her blood ran cold. She used the emergency keypad to open the cockpit door, a move reserved for the most dire of circumstances. The sight that greeted her would haunt her forever. Both pilots were slumped over in their seats, unresponsive, their faces ashen. A half-eaten chicken meal sat on the console between them. It was a horrific, silent tableau of disaster. She slammed the door shut, her mind racing. The autopilot was off. No one was flying the plane. They were in a slow, wide arc, heading downwards. She had to tell the passengers something, but what? Honesty would cause mass hysteria. Lying was impossible. She grabbed the intercom phone, her hand trembling. Her voice, strained and full of a terror she could not hide, crackled through the cabin. "Attention passengers! We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. The flight crew is unresponsive." A wave of gasps and sobs swept through the plane. This was it. This was the end. Then, in a voice of pure desperation, she asked the question that hung in the air like a death sentence, the last impossible hope. "Is there anyone on this plane? Is there anyone on this plane who knows how to fly?" The question was met with a stunned, horrified silence. In that moment of absolute despair, a boy in a middle seat in row 32 slowly, hesitantly, raised his hand. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one moved. All eyes, filled with a mixture of terror and disbelief, turned to row 32. They saw a kid, a skinny, scared-looking teenager, his hand trembling as he held it in the air. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Was this a joke? Some cruel, childish prank in the face of death? Arthur Sterling, who had stumbled back to his seat, stared at Leo with contempt. This was the boy from the terminal. The insignificant speck he had brushed aside. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. "Sit down, you idiot," someone shouted from the back. "This isn't a game." Leo's face flushed, and for a second, he started to lower his hand. The weight of their disbelief, their scorn, was crushing. His own grandmother's voice echoed in his head, telling him to stay quiet, to not make trouble. He was nobody. What could he possibly do? But then he looked out the window. He saw the curve of the earth, the clouds rushing past them as they fell. He heard the cries of the children, the quiet weeping of the woman next to him, and he thought of the thousands of hours he'd spent in front of his flickering screen, the manuals he'd read until the pages were soft and worn, the emergency landings he'd practiced over and over, the ones that ended in a simulated crash and the ones where he'd, just barely, saved his digital crew. It wasn't real, but it was all he had. It was all they had. He pushed his hand higher. Clara, the flight attendant, saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a prankster. It was the look of pure, unadulterated focus. It was the look of fear, yes, but of something else too. Determination. She pushed her way through the crowded aisle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knelt beside his row. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. "Leo. Leo Martinez." "Leo," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "You said you can fly. How? Are you a pilot?" Leo shook his head, his own voice barely a whisper. "No, not for real, but I have a simulator, a professional one. I've logged over 5,000 hours. I know the systems on a 777. I know the emergency procedures." He was rambling, the words tumbling out, desperate for her to believe him. "I've landed this plane in the simulator in worse conditions. Crosswinds, engine failure, total electrical failure." Arthur Sterling let out a short, harsh laugh from first class. "A video game? You're going to let a child who plays video games kill us all?" His voice was dripping with venom, but Clara ignored him. She looked at Leo's face, searching for a sign, any sign that this was a mistake. But what other choice did she have? To let them crash? To do nothing? She saw the detailed way he spoke about systems, the quiet confidence that lay beneath his terror. It was a 1 in a billion chance, but it was a chance. She made a decision, the decision that would change everything. "Come with me," she said, her voice firm. She helped him out of his seat. As they walked down the aisle towards the front, a path parting before them, the passengers stared. They saw a boy walking towards the cockpit, his face pale, his steps unsteady. They were placing their lives, their hopes, their final desperate prayers in the hands of a child. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only hope they had left. As Leo reached the cockpit door, he glanced back. He saw the faces of the 142 passengers, and he saw the face of Arthur Sterling, his expression no longer arrogant but a cocktail of shock, fear, and something else he couldn't name. It was the look of a man whose entire world had been turned upside down. Clara pushed open the door to the cockpit, and for Leo the world fell away. This wasn't a simulation anymore, this was real, and the lives of every single person on board were now in his hands. The moment Leo stepped into the cockpit, the simulated world he knew collided with a terrifying reality. The sheer number of buttons, switches and screens was overwhelming, far more complex than his homemade setup. The alarms were blaring, a cacophony of urgent, computerized warnings that screamed of imminent disaster. The yoke in front of him vibrated violently, and through the wide cockpit window, the world was tilted at a terrifying angle. This wasn't a game with a reset button. This was life and death. For a horrifying second, he froze. His mind went blank. The weight of 143 souls, including his own, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He could hear the muffled panic from the cabin behind him. He was just a boy, a poor kid who got a lucky ticket. What was he doing here? He was going to fail. He was going to kill them all. Clara, seeing the panic on his face, put a firm hand on his shoulder. "Leo," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You said you know what to do. What's first?" Her simple, direct question anchored him. It pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. He took a deep breath, forcing the air into his lungs. He scanned the panel, his eyes darting back and forth, connecting the real instruments to the digital ones in his memory. Okay, first things first, stop the descent. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the yoke. It was heavy, much heavier than his plastic joystick. He pulled back, his muscles straining. The plane groaned in protest, but the sickening downward pitch began to level out. He disengaged the corrupted autopilot. He was flying the plane, manually. He was flying a Boeing 777. "The radio," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to talk to air traffic control." Clara, her face a mask of focus, grabbed the headset from the co-pilot's seat and handed it to him. Leo fumbled with it, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. He put it on and pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he said, his voice shaking. "This is Flight 815. Our pilots are unresponsive. We have an untrained civilian at the controls." The response from the other side was a burst of static, then a calm, professional voice that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Flight 815, this is Chicago Center. We read you. Confirm your situation." "Who am I speaking with?" The controller's name was David, a man who had handled emergencies before, but never ever anything like this. He thought it was a prank. "My name is Leo Martinez. I'm a passenger. I'm 16 years old." There was a pause on the other end, a long heart-stopping pause. David, the controller, looked at his screen. He saw the flight path of 815, erratic and dangerous. This wasn't a prank. "Okay, Leo," David said, his voice a steady, reassuring presence in the storm of chaos. "Listen to me, we're going to get you through this. We have a team of pilots and technicians here, and we're going to talk you down. First, tell me what you see on your primary flight display." Leo began to read the numbers, his voice growing stronger with every word. Altitude, airspeed, heading. He was speaking the language. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the pilot. In the control center in Chicago, a crowd had gathered around David's station. The room, usually a low hum of activity, was dead silent. They listened, mouths agape, as a boy's voice described the state of a commercial airliner he was now in command of. Back on the plane, the passengers felt the change. The terrifying plunge had stopped. The plane was still shaking, but it felt controlled. A fragile, terrifying hope began to spread through the cabin. They didn't know who was flying, only that someone was. In seat 1A, Arthur Sterling stared at the back of the cockpit door. The boy, the insignificant boy he had sneered at. It was impossible, and yet they were still alive. His entire worldview, the bedrock of his identity, was cracking. He, Arthur Sterling, a master of the universe, was utterly dependent on a poor kid with a video game. The controller's voice came through the headset again, calm and clear. "All right, Leo, you're doing great. Now let's talk about getting you lined up for a runway. It's going to be tricky, but we'll do it together." Leo looked out the window at the vast emptiness of the sky. He was alone, yet connected to a lifeline of voices on the ground. The hardest part was yet to come. What followed was the most intense and surreal conversation in the history of aviation. It was a symphony conducted from 100 miles away, a duet between a terrified boy with impossible courage and a seasoned controller with nerves of steel. David, in the Chicago Center, became Leo's eyes, his brain, his co-pilot. He had a team of experienced 777 pilots behind him, shouting instructions, which David then translated into simple, clear commands for Leo. "Okay, Leo, I need you to find the MCP, the mode control panel. It's that long strip at the top of your dashboard. We need to set your heading. Turn the heading knob to the right to 320. Leo's hand, slick with sweat, reached for the knob. He turned it. The plane began a slow, deliberate bank to the right. It was working. He was actually steering the massive machine. The next 20 minutes were a blur of instructions and actions. Reduce throttle, adjust trim, monitor airspeed. Each command was a puzzle Leo had to solve in real time, matching David's words to the alien landscape of the cockpit. The simulator had taught him the what, but it could never teach him the feel. The weight of the controls, the groaning of the airframe, the constant gut-wrenching vibration. This was real. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and the cabin screamed again. Leo's heart leapt into his throat. He gripped the yoke, fighting to keep the wings level, just as he had done 100 times in his simulation. "Stay with me, Leo," David's voice crackled in his ear. "It's just a little rough air. You're doing fine. Just keep her steady." Inside the cabin, the passengers were on an emotional roller coaster. The brief moments of stability were shattered by lurches and dips, each one a reminder of their precarious situation. But through it all, Clara and the other flight attendants were pillars of strength. They moved through the cabin, offering words of comfort, holding hands, reassuring the terrified passengers that someone was in control, that there was a plan. They didn't know the details, only that a boy was fighting for their lives in the front. Arthur Sterling sat frozen in his seat. The spreadsheets on his broken laptop, the hostile takeover, the millions of dollars he was set to make, it all seemed like a foolish dream from another lifetime. His life was no longer in his own hands. It was in the hands of the boy he had dismissed without a second thought. He watched the flight attendants, people he had treated as servants now acting as saviors, their bravery a stark contrast to his own impotent fear. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. "Okay, Leo," said David. "We need to start our descent. We're going to divert you to O'Hare. They're clearing every runway for you. Every fire truck and ambulance in the city is heading there. You're not alone, son. The whole world is getting ready to catch you." The whole world. Leo swallowed hard. He initiated the descent, following David's instructions precisely. The nose dipped and the ground, which had been an abstract map, began to resolve into something real. Fields, roads, buildings. It was getting closer. Too close. The proximity alarms began to chirp. "Don't mind those, Leo," David said quickly. "We're low, but we're on the right path. Now, we need to lower the landing gear." Leo reached for the lever, his hand hovering over it. This was a critical step. He pulled it. A loud clunking sound reverberated through the plane, followed by a heavy jolt. It was the sound of their fate being sealed. There was no going back up. The runway was now visible in the distance, a long black strip of asphalt that looked impossibly small. It was his target, his final exam, the culmination of 1,000 hours of dreaming and a half-hour of living a nightmare. He could see the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles lining the runway like a silent, waiting army. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on his chest. His dream was right in front of him, but it had come in the form of his greatest fear. The final approach is the most unforgiving phase of any flight. It demands precision, a delicate touch, and an unshakable nerve. Leo had none of that. He had adrenaline, fear, and a voice in his headset. The plane was descending too quickly. The alarms were screaming again, this time with more urgency. "You're coming in too hot, Leo." David's voice was sharp, no longer just calming but commanding. "Pull back on the throttle, gently, and raise the nose. Pull back on the yoke, son. Pull back." Leo fought his instincts. The ground was rushing up to meet them, and his mind was screaming to go faster, to get it over with. But he listened to David. He eased back the throttle. He pulled on the heavy yoke, his arms burning with the effort. The plane's descent slowed, the angle of attack shifting. He was wrestling with a beast of steel and wind. "Now the flaps, Leo. We need more flaps. Move the lever to 30 degrees. Leo's eyes scanned the panel. He found the lever, his mind a whirlwind. Flaps 30. He remembered this from the manual. It would increase lift but also drag, helping to slow them down for landing. He moved the lever. The plane shuddered as the massive surfaces extended from the wings, the aerodynamics shifting dramatically. He had to fight to keep it stable. Through the cockpit window, the runway was growing at an alarming rate. It was no longer a tiny strip. It was a vast expanse of black, and it was coming at them at over 150 miles per hour. He could see individual fire trucks now, the flashing lights like 1,000 frantic heartbeats. His own heart was trying to beat its way out of his chest. "You're drifting to the left, Leo," David said. "Push the right rudder pedal. Just a little pressure." Rudder pedals, down on the floor. He'd almost forgotten about them. His feet, clumsy in his worn-out sneakers, found the pedals. He pushed. The nose of the plane corrected its course, aligning with the centerline of the runway. It was a clumsy, swaying movement, not the graceful alignment of a seasoned pilot, but it was enough. Good, son, that's it. Keep her steady. You're almost there. Just fly the plane onto the ground. Let it settle. In the cabin, it was dead silent. Every passenger was braced, their bodies rigid, their eyes squeezed shut or fixed on the seat in front of them. They could feel the finality of the moment. They were in the hands of a boy, and a God they hoped was listening. Arthur Sterling had his head bowed, his hands clasped together. He wasn't praying for his fortune or his company. He was praying for the boy in the cockpit. The ground was feet away. "Flare, Leo, flare!" David yelled. "Pull back on the yoke, lift the nose." Leo pulled with everything he had left. The plane's nose lifted just as the rear wheels made contact with the runway. It wasn't a kiss. It was a slam, a bone-jarring impact that sent a shockwave through the entire aircraft. The plane bounced, a terrifying skip back into the air for a split second before crashing down again. This time the nose gear hit, and the sound of screeching tires filled the air as Leo slammed on the brakes, just like he'd seen in videos. The plane swerved violently, threatening to skid off the runway, but he held on, fighting the rudder pedals, fighting the brakes, his knuckles white on the yoke. The massive jet groaned and screamed and shuddered as it tore down the runway, shedding speed at a ferocious rate. It seemed to go on forever, an eternity of noise and vibration. And then it stopped. The plane was crooked, halfway off the runway, one wing dipping towards the grass, but it was stopped. It was on the ground, and it was in one piece. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the dying whine of the engines and Leo's own ragged breath in the headset. He had done it. He had landed the plane. The silence in the cabin lasted for 3 surreal seconds. Then it was broken, not by a scream, but by a single person starting to clap. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire cabin erupted in a wave of thunderous applause, cheers, and sobbing relief. Strangers were hugging strangers, their faces wet with tears. They had survived. They were alive. In the cockpit, Leo let go of the yoke. His arms fell to his sides, completely numb. He slumped back in the captain's chair, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving an overwhelming exhaustion in its place. He could hear the cheering through the cockpit door. He could see the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles surrounding the plane, fire trucks spraying foam on the hot brakes as a precaution. He had done it. The thought was too big to comprehend. The emergency slides deployed, and the passengers evacuated, sliding down to the tarmac where they were met by paramedics and airport staff. They were dazed, stumbling, but whole. As Clara, the flight attendant, helped the last few passengers, she looked back towards the cockpit. She walked back in and saw Leo still sitting in the chair, looking small and overwhelmed. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Leo," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you did it. You saved us. You saved everyone." He looked up at her, his eyes wide. And finally the dam broke. Tears streamed down his face, silent tears of shock, relief, and exhaustion. When he finally emerged from the plane, the world was waiting. News cameras, journalists, FBI agents. The story had already broken, a garbled, unbelievable tale of a boy pilot. They all rushed towards him, but federal agents quickly cordoned him off, recognizing he was a child in a state of shock. He was escorted to a private room in the terminal where his grandmother, Elena, was waiting. The authorities had flown her out on a private jet the moment they knew what was happening. She ran to him, wrapping him in her arms, crying into his shoulder, murmuring, "Mijo, mijo," over and over again. It was the only welcome he needed, but another one was coming. Later, after giving his preliminary statement, as Leo sat with his grandmother, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Arthur Sterling. He looked different. His expensive suit was disheveled, his face was pale, and his eyes, usually so cold and hard, were red-rimmed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, profound humility that seemed to alter his very posture. He walked slowly towards Leo. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at the boy whose existence he hadn't even properly acknowledged just hours before. Then, in a voice choked with emotion, he said, I don't know what to say." He knelt, an act so foreign to him it looked painful. He was no longer a titan looking down from his tower. He was just a man brought to his knees. "You saved my life," he whispered. "You saved my daughter's life. She was on the plane with me. I was so rude to you. I was a fool. The way I treated you." "There's no excuse." He looked at Leo, his eyes pleading for an understanding he knew he didn't deserve. "How can I ever repay you?" Leo, exhausted and overwhelmed, simply shook his head. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I just did what I had to do." But Sterling wouldn't hear of it. This moment had shattered his world, cracked open his heart of stone, and forced him to see what truly mattered. It wasn't money, or power, or takeovers. It was courage. It was character. It was the quiet, unassuming boy who had faced down death and won. The news of Leo's heroism was no longer a local story. It was a global phenomenon, the lead item on every news channel in the world, and the story had reached the highest office in the land. The next day, as Leo was trying to process the whirlwind of events, a call came. It was from a number he didn't recognize, a Washington, D.C. area code. He answered it, and a formal voice on the other end said, "Please hold for the President of the United States." The days that followed were a dream. Leo Martinez, the boy from the wrong side of the tracks, was an international hero. His face was on the cover of every newspaper and magazine. The story was irresistible. A tale of impossible odds, of David and Goliath at 30,000 feet. But for Leo, the most surreal moment was the flight to Washington. This time, he wasn't in a cramped middle seat. He and his grandmother were flown on a private jet, personally chartered and paid for by a profoundly changed Arthur Sterling. Sterling himself did not join them. He said he wasn't worthy of being in Leo's presence yet. Instead, he had started the process of making amends. He publicly apologized for his past business practices. He set up a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation managed by Clara, the flight attendant, to support underprivileged youth and provide aviation scholarships. His transformation was as dramatic as the emergency that had caused it. Walking into the Oval Office was more intimidating than walking into the cockpit. But the president greeted him not with formality, but with a warm, fatherly smile. He shook Leo's hand firmly and hugged his grandmother. He spoke of courage, of grace under pressure, and of how Leo represented the very best of the American spirit. He told Leo that the nation was in his debt. "We give medals to soldiers who show bravery in battle," the president said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "But you, son, you were a soldier in the sky. You faced an enemy of chaos and fear, and you won. You saved 143 lives." He then presented Leo with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. The medal felt heavy in Leo's hand, a weight of recognition that was almost too much to bear. But that wasn't the gift. The president continued, "A medal is a symbol, Leo. It honors the past. But your country wants to invest in your future." He explained that a unique, bipartisan bill had been passed in a single day, the Leo Martinez Act. It granted Leo a full 4-year scholarship to any university or flight academy of his choosing, including the prestigious United States Air Force Academy, with all expenses paid by the federal government. It was a gift that money couldn't buy. It was a future, a promise. It was the sky handed to him. Tears welled up in Elena's eyes. Her boy, her mijo, who the world had tried to keep on the ground, was now being told to fly as high as he could. Leo's dream was no longer a secret passion pursued on a junk computer. It was his destiny. He accepted the appointment to the Air Force Academy. Arthur Sterling, true to his word, became his mentor, not in business, but in life, guiding him and ensuring his grandmother was cared for the rest of her days. The story of Flight 815 became a legend, a modern-day fable taught to illustrate that heroism isn't about the suit you wear or the money in your bank account. It's about what you do when the world is falling apart. It's about the courage that can be found in the most unexpected of hearts. Leo Martinez went on to become an exceptional pilot, but he never lost the humility forged in that terrifying half-hour. He would often look at his hands and remember the feeling of the yoke, the weight of all those lives. He learned that true value is measured not by altitude or riches, but by character, by compassion, and by the courage to step up when you are called, no matter how small you think you are. His story reminds us all that sometimes the person you dismiss today might just be the hero you pray for tomorrow. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful life lessons every week.